In this 1902 portrait, the girl's bright eyes impress experts after zooming in. The photograph arrived at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery in a plain cardboard box, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper that crumbled at the slightest touch. Dr. Rebecca Hartwell, a specialist in early American photography, carefully lifted the frame and studied the image before her. A family of 4 stared back through time, a stern father with a thick mustache, a mother whose hands rested protectively on her children's shoulders, a boy of perhaps 10 standing rigid as a soldier, and a girl no older than 8. The photograph was dated 1902, taken somewhere in rural Pennsylvania according to the faded inscription on the back. The quality was remarkable for its age, sharp, well-preserved, the kind of portrait that spoke of a family's pride and means. They had paid good money for this sitting, dressed in their finest clothes, the father in a dark suit, the mother in high-collared lace, the children scrubbed and combed to perfection. Rebecca had seen thousands of such photographs during her 15 years at the museum. The early 20th century had produced countless family portraits, each one a window into lives long vanished. Most ended up forgotten in attics or estate sales, occasionally surfacing when descendants cleaned out old homes or settled estates. This particular photograph had been donated by a woman in Philadelphia who claimed no connection to the family depicted, only that she had found it in a house she purchased. What caught Rebecca's attention, however, was something indefinable: the girl's expression. While her brother stood stiff and uncomfortable, clearly eager for the ordeal to end, and her parents maintained the serious composure expected of the era, the girl looked directly at the camera with an intensity that seemed to transcend the century between them. Her eyes were bright, alert, almost challenging. There was something knowing in that gaze, something that suggested a personality too large for the formal constraints of the photograph. Rebecca leaned closer, adjusting her desk lamp to better illuminate the image. There was something about those eyes, something she couldn't quite place, a quality that drew her in, that made her want to understand who this child had been. She reached for her magnifying glass, then stopped. Better equipment would serve her purposes. She carefully photographed the portrait with her high-resolution camera, uploading the image to her computer. With professional software, she could examine every detail without risking damage to the original. As the image filled her screen, Rebecca zoomed in on the girl's face, increasing the magnification slowly. The features became clearer, the slight upturn of her lips, the way her chin lifted just slightly, the determined set of her small jaw. And then she focused on the eyes themselves, and her breath caught in her throat. That wasn't possible. She leaned closer to the screen, her heart beginning to race. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she increased the magnification further. The girl's left eye filled her monitor, and there it was, unmistakable even across 122 years. A distinct vertical gap in the iris, shaped like a keyhole or an upside-down teardrop. The pupil extended downward in a narrow fissure that reached almost to the bottom of the iris, creating an elongated opening where the tissue had failed to close completely. It was a coloboma, a rare congenital condition where part of the eye's structure fails to fuse during fetal development. She had read about colobomas in medical texts during her research on historical portraiture, had even seen modern photographs of the condition, but never in a photograph this old. The clarity was extraordinary. Most portrait photography from 1902 lacked the resolution to capture such fine detail, especially in something as small as the iris. The cameras of that era, while capable of producing sharp images, typically couldn't render such minute features with this level of precision. This photographer had been exceptionally skilled, using optimal lighting and focus, and the preservation of the print had been nothing short of miraculous. Rebecca sat back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. A coloboma would have significantly affected the girl's vision. The condition could cause blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and reduced depth perception. In 1902, medical understanding of such conditions was rudimentary at best. Children with visible differences often faced cruel treatment, social isolation, even institutionalization in specialized schools far from their families. Yet this girl stood proudly with her family, well-dressed and apparently cherished. The way her mother's hands rested on her shoulders suggested protection and love. not shame. What had her life been like? How had she navigated a world that wasn't kind to difference? Had she been able to attend regular school? What opportunities had been available to a girl with impaired vision in turn-of-the-century America? She pulled up the donation records on her computer, scrolling through the sparse information. The Philadelphia woman who had contributed the photograph was named Janet Morrison, elderly but still sharp when Rebecca had spoken with her by phone weeks earlier. Janet had mentioned finding several items in the house during renovations, but had seemed uninterested in their history. "Just old things," she had said dismissively. "Thought the museum might want them. Better than throwing them away." Rebecca dialed Janet's number, her fingers drumming impatiently on her desk as the phone rang. After 4 rings, the woman answered, her voice tentative. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Dr. Hartwell from the Smithsonian. I'm calling about that family portrait you donated last month." "Oh yes, the old photograph. Did you find it interesting?" "Very much so," Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice calm despite her excitement. "I was wondering, was there anything else in the house? Letters, documents, anything that might identify the family or provide more context?" There was a long pause. "Well, there were some papers in the attic, boxes of them actually. I left most of them there. Figured they were just garbage, old receipts and such." The house stood on a quiet street in Philadelphia's Germantown neighborhood, a 3-story Victorian with peeling paint and a sagging porch that spoke of decades of deferred maintenance. Ancient oak trees lined the street, their bare branches reaching toward the gray December sky. Janet Morrison met Rebecca at the door, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes behind thick glasses and an air of practical efficiency. She wore a cardigan against the cold and gestured Rebecca inside with a brisk wave. She led Rebecca through rooms crowded with furniture covered in dust sheets, the air thick with the musty smell of closed spaces. They climbed 2 flights of narrow stairs, the old wood creaking under their feet, and finally reached a cramped attic that smelled of old wood, dust, and decades of undisturbed air. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the cramped space. "Haven't been up here much myself," Janet admitted, gesturing to several boxes and a battered trunk in the corner. "My knees aren't what they used to be, and honestly, it's depressing going through other people's abandoned lives. Take your time. Take all day if you need to. I'll be downstairs having tea." Rebecca waited until Janet's footsteps faded down the stairs, then approached the trunk with the reverence of an archaeologist entering an undisturbed tomb. The leather straps were cracked and brittle but still functional. She lifted the lid carefully, mindful that anything inside might be fragile. Inside, wrapped in cloth that might once have been white but had yellowed to cream, were stacks of papers, letters bound with faded ribbon, a few small leather-bound books, and what looked like personal effects carefully preserved. She began methodically, photographing everything before touching it, creating a visual record of exactly how items were positioned. The first letters were mundane, receipts from a general store dated 1895, a deed to property in rural Pennsylvania, correspondence about crop yields and livestock prices. Then, beneath a layer of tissue paper, she found a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by handling, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting inside was elegant, feminine, written in careful script with dark ink that had faded to brown. She read the first entry, dated September 3rd, 1899. "Today we welcomed our daughter into this world. She is perfect in every way, though the doctor seems troubled by her eye. He says there is something unusual about it, that she may not see well from it. But when she looks at me, I see strength there. I see determination. I have decided to name her Clara." Rebecca's pulse quickened. Clara. She had a name now. The girl in the photograph had an identity beyond that frozen moment in 1902. She continued reading, carefully turning each fragile page. The journal entries chronicled the early years of Clara's life, her first steps at 13 months, her first words, the challenges of raising a child who saw the world differently than other children. The mother, whose name was revealed as Emma, wrote with fierce protective love that leaped off the pages even after more than a century. June 14, 1901. Clara is 2 years old today. She runs and plays like any child, but I notice how she tilts her head when she looks at things, how she reaches for objects with such careful precision. She is learning to compensate for what her left eye cannot see. The doctor suggested we take her to a specialist in Philadelphia, but Thomas worries about the cost. More than that, I think he worries about what they might say, what they might recommend. Other entries revealed the strain this placed on the family. November 12, 1904. The teacher sent Clara home again today, claiming she cannot keep up with the other children, that her eye frightens the younger ones. Thomas is furious. He wants to send her to a special school in the city, an institution for children with afflictions, but I refuse. I absolutely refuse. She is not afflicted, she is different, and difference is not disease. Clara belongs with us, in our home, learning alongside her brother. Rebecca found herself drawn into Emma's world, feeling the woman's frustration and determination across the decades. The entries painted a picture of a woman fighting against the limitations society wanted to impose on her daughter. Emma had been educated herself. Her writing was too sophisticated, too articulate for someone without formal schooling, and she was determined that Clara would have every advantage she could provide. An entry from March 1906 revealed a turning point. Thomas has finally agreed, though it took weeks of arguing. Clara will continue her lessons at home. I will teach her myself. Miss Patterson from the normal school has agreed to provide materials and guidance, and to test Clara periodically to ensure she is learning properly. Clara's mind is sharp, sharper than Henry's if I'm being honest, though I would never say so aloud. She deserves every opportunity to develop it. The entries became less frequent as the years passed, as Emma's time was consumed with the daily work of running a household and educating her daughter. But those that remained showed Clara growing into an intelligent, determined young woman. September 1910. Clara is 11 now and reading far beyond her years. She has devoured every book in our small library and begs for more. She asks questions I cannot always answer. Yesterday she asked me why her eye is different, whether God made a mistake with her. I told her God makes no mistakes, only variations, and that her difference makes her unique, not lesser. Then, tucked between the journal's pages, Rebecca found a newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile. The headline read, "Local girls' photographs win recognition." She read it carefully, her excitement mounting with each word. The brief article, dated October 1911, described how Clara Thompson, age 16, had won second place in a regional photography competition sponsored by the Pennsylvania Art Society. Her winning entry was a portrait of her mother. Rebecca's hands shook as she held the fragile clipping. Clara had become a photographer. A girl with impaired vision, a girl with a coloboma that would have limited her depth perception and created blind spots in her field of view, had chosen a profession that depended entirely on seeing. It seemed almost paradoxical, yet here was the evidence, preserved in newsprint for over a century. She set the clipping aside carefully and dug deeper into the trunk. More newspaper clippings emerged, chronicling Clara's growing reputation in Philadelphia's artistic circles. By 1915, she had opened her own studio on Chestnut Street in downtown Philadelphia. By 1918, she was being commissioned for portraits of prominent families, business leaders, and even minor politicians. The articles never explicitly mentioned her coloboma, but several noted her unique perspective and distinctive eye for detail in ways that suggested the writers knew something set her apart. One review from 1920 was particularly revealing. Miss Thompson's portraits capture something that eludes most photographers, the essence of her subjects' inner lives. Where others see only surfaces, she perceives depths. One wonders if her singular vision allows her to see what others miss. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, Rebecca found a leather portfolio. Inside were dozens of photographs, all original prints, each bearing Clara's signature in the corner. They were extraordinary. Not stiff formal portraits like most photography of the era, but intimate studies that revealed character and emotion. Portraits of farmers with soil-stained hands and weathered faces, factory workers with tired eyes and proud shoulders, children playing in city streets with an unself-conscious joy, elderly immigrants whose faces were carved with the stories of hard lives lived with dignity. Each image captured not just appearance, but essence, a quality that transcended mere technical skill. Clara had somehow learned to see past the surface, to find the humanity in each subject. Her compositions were unconventional. Subjects often looked away from the camera, or were captured in unguarded moments, or were framed in ways that emphasized their environments as much as their faces. One photograph in particular caught Rebecca's attention. It showed an elderly woman sitting by a window, afternoon light falling across her weathered face at an angle that highlighted every line and shadow. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her expression was peaceful but touched with a sadness that seemed to come from deep within. The composition was masterful, the technical execution flawless. The signature in the corner read, "Emma Thompson, 1932, photographer, Clara Thompson." Rebecca sat back on her heels, surrounded by the detritus of these long-vanished lives, and felt the weight of discovery settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just a story about an unusual medical condition captured in an old photograph. This was a story about resilience, adaptation, and triumph over limitation. Clara had taken what society viewed as a handicap and transformed it into a unique artistic vision. Back at her office in Washington 3 days later, Rebecca couldn't stop thinking about Clara Thompson. She had documented her findings carefully, photographed every item in the trunk, and convinced Janet Morrison to donate the entire collection to the museum. But the story felt incomplete, like a book with missing chapters. What had happened to Clara after 1932? Had she continued her work? How long had she lived? Had she ever married? Had children who might have inherited her gift? Rebecca began systematically searching historical records, starting with census data. The 1920 census showed Clara living alone in Philadelphia at an address on Walnut Street. Her occupation listed as photographer, own studio. She would have been 25 then, an independent professional woman at a time when such things were still relatively rare. The 1930 census showed her at a larger address on Market Street, still listed as photographer, still living alone. No husband, no children. Marriage records from Philadelphia showed nothing. Clara had apparently never married. That itself was unusual for the era, but not unheard of, especially for women pursuing professional careers who often had to choose between marriage and work. Many professions actively discouraged or even prohibited married women from continuing to work. Rebecca contacted the Pennsylvania Historical Society, the Philadelphia City Archives, and several local historical organizations, explaining her research. Each search revealed small pieces of Clara's life, fragments that slowly built into a larger picture. She had been active in women's suffrage movements in the years before the 19th Amendment was ratified. She had taught photography to young women at a settlement house in South Philadelphia. She had documented the lives of Philadelphia's working poor during the Depression, creating a visual record that now seemed prescient of Dorothea Lange's more famous Farm Security Administration photographs. Then Rebecca found something that changed the trajectory of her research entirely, a reference to Clara in a 1945 academic journal titled Studies in Visual Perception. The article, written by Dr. Martin Schreiber of the University of Pennsylvania's Medical School, discussed how individuals with monocular vision primarily from one eye, often developed exceptional depth perception through learned cues that normally sighted people never consciously used. Clara Thompson was mentioned as a case study, identified only as a professional photographer who had achieved remarkable success despite congenital visual impairment resulting from iris coloboma. Rebecca immediately contacted the University of Pennsylvania's Medical School archives. After several days of waiting that felt like weeks, she received a response. They had Dr. Schreiber's research files in their collection, and yes, there was material related to Clara Thompson. Could she come to Philadelphia to review it? She booked a train ticket that same afternoon. 3 days later, Rebecca sat in a climate-controlled archive room at the University of Pennsylvania, white cotton gloves on her hands, carefully turning the pages of Dr. Schreiber's research files. The room was quiet except for the whisper of paper and the soft hum of the ventilation system maintaining the precise temperature and humidity needed to preserve these documents. Clara had been 50 years old when she participated in Dr. Schreiber's study in 1944. She had agreed to a series of tests and interviews, all documented in meticulous detail. The files included visual acuity tests, depth perception assessments, and lengthy interview transcripts where Clara described her experience living with monocular vision and how she had learned to adapt. The notes revealed that Clara's coloboma had indeed limited her vision in her left eye significantly. She had approximately 20% normal vision in that eye, enough to perceive light, shadow, and general shapes, but not enough to read or see fine detail. Her right eye, however, had compensated beautifully, developing what Dr. Schreiber called hyperacuity, an enhanced ability to perceive and process visual information. But what fascinated Dr. Schreiber most was how Clara had learned to work around her limitation. She explained in the interview transcripts that, as a young child, she had discovered that by turning her head slightly to the right and using quick scanning movements, she could build a complete mental picture of her surroundings. She had developed an acute awareness of spatial relationships, constantly calculating distances and depths through movement, comparison, and learned experience rather than relying on stereoscopic vision. "The camera sees with one eye," Clara had told Dr. Schreiber in an interview dated March 1944. "In that fundamental way, the camera and I are alike. We both translate three-dimensional reality into a two-dimensional image. I understand the camera's limitations intimately because they are, in many ways, my own limitations. But I also understand how to work within them, how to create the illusion of depth and dimension through careful attention to light, shadow, composition, and perspective. What others do instinctively, without thinking, I must do deliberately, with conscious intention. This makes me think more carefully about every image I create." The files included photographs of Clara at age 50, taken for the medical study. She looked directly at the camera with the same intensity Rebecca had seen in the 1902 family portrait. Her hair was gray now, pulled back in a practical bun, and her face was lined with the marks of 5 decades of life. But her eyes, both of them, were bright and alert, full of intelligence and determination. The coloboma was clearly visible in the close-up medical photographs, the keyhole shape even more distinct than in the childhood portrait. Dr. Schreiber's notes contained something even more valuable than medical data. Clara's own words about her experience, her philosophy of seeing and creating. Rebecca read through pages of interview transcripts, feeling as though she was finally hearing Clara's voice across the decades. "People assume that because I see differently, I see less," Clara had said in one interview. "But I've come to believe I see more, or at least I see with more intention. I notice things others miss because I must pay attention. Every photograph I take requires conscious choice about what to include in the frame, how to arrange the elements, where to position myself and my subject. I cannot rely on automatic perception or casual glances. This makes me a better observer, and I believe it makes me a better artist." In another section, Dr. Schreiber had asked Clara about the challenges she had faced building a career in photography. Her response was revealing. "When I first opened my studio, some potential clients would leave as soon as they noticed my eye. They assumed that someone who looked different must work differently, must produce inferior results. I learned to let my work speak for itself. I would show them my portfolio, and usually the photographs convinced them where my words could not. The pictures didn't lie. They showed that I could see what needed to be seen, could capture what needed to be captured." Dr. Schreiber had also documented something remarkable about Clara's working method. She described how she had developed a unique approach to portrait photography that turned her limitation into an advantage. Because she had to study her subjects carefully to compensate for her reduced depth perception, she spent more time with each person she photographed, observing them, talking with them, understanding them. This created a rapport that showed in the final images. "When I photograph someone, I'm not trying to capture what they look like," Clara explained. "I'm trying to capture who they are. That requires patience, attention, and empathy. My eye, both eyes really, force me to slow down, to look carefully, to see beyond the surface. What began as a limitation has become my greatest asset as an artist." The research had concluded in 1946, with Dr. Schreiber writing a glowing assessment of Clara's adaptive capabilities and recommending her as a subject for further study of visual compensation mechanisms. He noted that she represented a remarkable case of how humans could overcome perceived disabilities through determination, intelligence, and creative adaptation. But there was no record of any follow-up research in the files. Rebecca made careful notes, photographed the relevant pages with permission from the archivist, and tried to trace what had happened to Clara after 1946. The trail seemed to grow cold. There were no more academic references, no more newspaper articles she could find. It was as if Clara had simply disappeared from the public record. She expanded her search, looking through obituary indexes, cemetery records, and Social Security death records. For several frustrating days, she found nothing. Then, almost by accident, she discovered a small notice tucked into the back pages of the Philadelphia Inquirer from December 1967. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read the obituary on the microfilm screen of the Philadelphia Public Library. Thompson Clara, age 68. Passed peacefully December 18th at her home. Professional photographer for over 50 years, known throughout Philadelphia for her portraits and documentary work. She captured the lives of ordinary Philadelphians with extraordinary compassion and skill. A lifelong advocate for women's education and the arts, she taught photography to countless young women and helped establish the Philadelphia Women's Arts Collective in 1933. Never married, no immediate survivors. Memorial gifts may be made to the Philadelphia Women's Arts Collective. Services private. 68 years old, Clara had lived a full life, though not as long as Rebecca had hoped. But 50 years as a working photographer, that was remarkable for any era, but especially for a woman with a visible disability in the early 20th century. And she had been teaching, passing on her knowledge and her philosophy to the next generation. Rebecca immediately looked up the Philadelphia Women's Arts Collective. It still existed, though under a slightly modified name, the Philadelphia Women's Arts Coalition. She called their office that same afternoon. The director, a woman named Patricia Cole, was intrigued by Rebecca's call. "We have some archival material from our founding members," Patricia said. Clara Thompson was one of them. Actually, she was one of the 3 women who established our first teaching program in 1933. "We don't have much, but you're welcome to see what we have. When can you come?" 2 days later, Rebecca was sitting in the Coalition's modest headquarters in Center City, Philadelphia, a renovated townhouse that served as gallery space, teaching studios, and offices. Patricia brought out a cardboard box of materials that had been stored in their climate-controlled archives: photographs, letters, meeting minutes from the 1930s and 1940s, and a few personal effects. Clara's signature appeared throughout the documents, always in the same elegant handwriting Rebecca had first seen in Emma's journal. The meeting minutes showed Clara as a consistent advocate for expanding opportunities for women artists, particularly for those from working-class backgrounds who couldn't afford expensive training. One letter, dated April 1935, particularly moved Rebecca. Clara had written to the collective's board advocating for a scholarship program for young women interested in photography. "We must open doors that were closed to previous generations. Every girl with talent and determination deserves the chance to pursue her art, regardless of her economic circumstances or any perceived limitations. I speak from personal experience when I say that what others see as handicaps can become unique strengths when met with opportunity and encouragement." Patricia pulled out one more item from the box, a photograph in a simple wooden frame, its glass slightly clouded with age. "This hung in our original building on South Street," she said. "It's Clara, taken around 1950 by one of her students." The photograph showed Clara in her studio, surrounded by cameras and developing equipment. She was in her mid-50s, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a work apron stained with developing chemicals. She held a large format camera up to her face, about to take a photograph, her eye pressed to the viewfinder. And there, clearly visible even in this candid shot, was the distinctive keyhole shape in her left iris, the coloboma that had defined so much of her life's journey. Rebecca stared at the image, feeling the weight of everything she had learned about Clara Thompson over these past months. This woman hadn't hidden her difference. Even here, in a photograph that would hang in a public building, In an image taken by one of her own students, she had allowed herself to be seen fully, coloboma and all. That took courage, especially in an era when any visible difference invited stares, questions, and judgment. Patricia noticed Rebecca's focus. "You see it too," she said quietly, pointing to Clara's eye. "When I first saw this photograph years ago, when I started working here, I wondered about it. I asked some of the older members if they knew the story, but none of them did. Clara had died decades before any of them joined. We had no information beyond what's in our archives, and Clara herself seems to have been a private person. Now you've found her story." Rebecca spent the rest of the afternoon going through the coalition's materials with Patricia's help. She found records of the dozens of young women Clara had taught between 1933 and her death in 1967. Over 300 students in total. Many had gone on to successful careers in photography and related fields. Several had become teachers themselves, passing Clara's methods on to yet another generation. She found letters from grateful students, written over the decades, thanking Clara for her patience, her high standards, her refusal to accept excuses or self-imposed limitations. One letter from a student named Dorothy who had studied with Clara in 1938 captured something essential about her teaching philosophy. "You taught me to see with intention, Miss Thompson. You showed me that every photograph is a choice, what to include, what to exclude, where to stand, how to arrange light and shadow to reveal truth rather than merely record appearance. But more than that, you taught me that being different doesn't mean being less. You never let your eye limit you or define you. Instead, you made it part of your vision, part of what made your work distinctive. That's the most important lesson I learned in your studio. That our differences, when we embrace them rather than hide from them, can become our greatest strengths." Rebecca photographed everything carefully, documenting each item for the museum's records. As the winter afternoon faded into evening, Patricia made an offer. "Would the Smithsonian be interested in these materials? We've preserved them as best we can, but we don't have proper climate-controlled storage or the resources to properly catalog and maintain them. Clara's work and her legacy deserve better than we can provide." Rebecca could barely contain her excitement. "Absolutely. This is exactly the kind of collection we need. It tells a story that's been overlooked for far too long, about disability, adaptation, artistic vision, and women's history all intertwined." They made arrangements for the transfer of the materials, discussing logistics and paperwork. As Rebecca prepared to leave, her briefcase full of documentation and her head full of plans, Patricia walked her to the door and asked, "What first drew you to Clara? What made you look so closely at that old family portrait?" Rebecca thought back to that moment months ago when she had first zoomed in on the 1902 photograph, the instant she had noticed the keyhole iris and felt her breath catch. She thought about all the hours she had spent in archives and libraries, all the documents she had read, all the pieces of Clara's story she had painstakingly assembled. "Her eyes," Rebecca said simply. Even as a child in that photograph, she looked at the camera like she understood something the rest of us were missing, like she saw through the lens to something deeper. She wasn't just being photographed, she was observing the process, studying it, preparing even then to make it her own. "I had to know who she was, what she had become." Patricia smiled. "And now you know. Now we all will."